When the phone rang at my house, this very gruff voice said, "Mrs. Ellis." I said, "That's my mama. She's a real nice lady. She lives in Kentucky. I'm Elizabeth. Could I help you with something?" He said, "Very funny." I thought. He said, "I am Mr. Thomas, and I am calling you from the financial aid office of the university, where you have recently submitted all the paperwork for the grandson that you claim to have raised for financial aid." I thought, claim to have raised? Why would any grandparent claim to have raised a child unless they had to? But I said, "Mr. Thomas, I worked awful hard on that paperwork." He said, "You must not have worked very hard, lady. You got the first line wrong." I was thinking, I was pretty sure the first line was my name. I was betting on having gotten that part right. I thought, now over on page 2, when they started asking for all those figures, percentages have never been my strong suit, but I was pretty sure I got my name right. He said, "No, I mean at the other end of the first line. I asked you what you did for a living, and you gave me your hobby." I said, "I'm pretty sure I wrote down storyteller." He said, "I don't want to know what you do for fun. I want to know how you make your living." I said, "Mr. Thomas, that is the way I make my living. I am a storyteller." He said, "I don't even understand what you're talking about." I said, "Well, gosh, Mr. Thomas, surely when you were a little boy, somebody must have told you stories." He said, "I don't think so." I said, "Mr. Thomas, I'm going to say some words and you tell me if they sound familiar." "Once upon a time." He said, "You mean to tell me that you just stand up in front of people and talk and they give you money?" I said, "I like to think of it as being more complicated than that. But that is about the size of it, I guess." He said, "I wish somebody would give me money for running my mouth." I said, "Maybe if you thought about what you were going to say before you opened it, they might." And our relationship began to slide downhill from that very moment. He said, "I am very dissatisfied with the paperwork that you sent me, and I'm going to send you an entirely new set of paperwork, and I want you to fill it out and get it back to me by the deadline, because I am not a person who grants people extensions." I thought, boy, I'm sure that's true. 2 days later, another set of paperwork arrived in my mailbox. It looked exactly like the set I'd already sent in, but hey, if it was going to help Chris go to college, I read that paperwork as thoroughly as I possibly could. I even got down and read the tiny little print at the bottom of the page, and that's how I discovered that there was an 800 number at the national office where you could call and ask questions, and boy, I did. I went through all that paperwork with a fine-tooth comb. I even got one of my friends who teaches high school math to go over every single one of my figures. And when I mailed that paperwork back to Mr. Thomas, I was certain that even he was going to be happy with it. Wrong. 2 days later, my phone rang. "Mrs. Ellis." I said, "That's my mother. He said, "Don't even start with me." He said, "I am extremely displeased with this set of paperwork that you sent me." I said, "Mr. Thomas, I don't know that I ever worked harder on anything in my life than I worked on the paperwork that I sent you. He said, don't try to fool me. I know a lot about you now that I didn't know when we had our first conversation. I have looked you up on the internet. I now know that you are one of the best known storytellers in the United States. I said, Mr. Thomas, people have been awful nice to me. He said, where's the money? I said, what money, Mr. Thomas? He said, the money you have made telling stories all those years. I said, well, gosh, Mr. Thomas, I went over every bit of that. You know, I called that 800 number down at the bottom of the page, and Sharon in the national office, she's having her gum surgery today. She's going to be feeling a lot better, Mr. Thomas. She said that you didn't have to claim the house that you're buying or the car that you drive. And I filled out everything else, Mr. Thomas. That's all there is. He said, huh. Nobody does anything for 25 years at the top of their game unless they're making a lot of money. Where's the money? I said, Mr. Thomas, I don't even know what to tell you. He said, I see here that you received the Circle of Excellence Award from the National Storytelling Association. Just what did you receive when you were given that? I said, a plaque. He said, and I see that you received the John Henry Falk Award from the Texas Storytelling Association. What did you receive when you got that? I said, a T-shirt. He said, I don't think this is funny. I said, well, you know, Mr. Thomas, now that you mention it, I'm not thinking it's very funny either. He said, I am going to send you another set of paperwork, and I expect you to fill it out completely, leaving nothing out, and get it back to me by the deadline, because I am not a person who grants people extensions. I said, Mr. Thomas, I wouldn't dream of asking for an extension. 2 days later, another set of paperwork appeared in my mailbox. This set of paperwork was completely different than anything that I had seen before. It said that I was supposed to take this set of paperwork to my bank, and that I was supposed to have them notarize it to show whether or not I had a safety deposit box. I could only think of one reason why anybody might think I would have a safety deposit box, and that would be if they thought I had a large stack of cash socked away in one somewhere. So, with a happy heart, I took my pieces of paperwork down to my bank. And I soon discovered that if I had had a safety deposit box, they would have notarized it for free. But since I did not have a safety deposit box, it was going to cost me $10. And then, of course, I had to overnight it to Mr. Thomas, which was $13.95, because as we all know, Mr. Thomas is not a man who grants people extensions. I was now down $23.95 trying to prove I did not have something. I can understand how you prove you do have something. I am still confused about how you would prove that you do not have something, and frankly was beginning to feel more sympathetic towards Saddam Hussein. Not a lot, but a little bit. 2 days later, the phone rang. This very gruff voice said, Mrs. Ellis. I said, Mr. Thomas, how are you doing? He said, not very well. You have persisted in sending me incomplete and inaccurate paperwork for your grandson's financial aid. I said, Mr. Thomas, I swear to you, I have gone over that paperwork with a fine-tooth comb. I have made absolutely certain that I answered every single question correctly. I even faxed that paperwork to Sharon at the national office. She's feeling a lot better, by the way. They're going to take the stitches out tomorrow. She said you didn't have to claim the car you're driving, and you didn't have to claim the house you're buying. And she said that everything I had listed on that was correct. And he said, some people would say anything. I said, she's at the national office, Mr. Thomas. She's got an 800 number. And he said, like I would care about her 800 number? You have persisted in sending this filled out incompletely. There are pages on here that had nothing on them at all. You persisted in sending it back, listing absolutely no assets and no investments. I said, Mr. Thomas, there's a good reason for that. I do not have assets. I do not have investments except for the house I'm buying and the car that I drive. And he said, I don't begin to believe you. And that was when I lost my temper. I said, Mr. Thomas, you are absolutely right. I have made investments, and I do have an asset. He said, I knew it. And to prove to you that I am really a nice guy at heart, if you will disclose them to me on the telephone right this minute, I will not even penalize you overly much for not being forthcoming in our earlier conversations. I said, all right, Mr. Thomas, are you ready? Yes, he said. I said, in the 18 years since this child was given to me to raise, I estimate that I have invested in about 400 pairs of blue jeans. In the 18 years since this child was given to me to raise, I figure I have invested in about 65 pairs of athletic shoes. In the 18 years since this child was given me to raise, I have invested in 18 Christmas trees and the presents that went under them. I have invested in 18 birthday cakes and the presents that went with that. I have invested in YMCA. I have invested in Little League. I have invested in 5 years of family therapy, which, by the way, Mr. Thomas, was the best money I ever spent in my entire life. I have invested in 10 years of music lessons. I have invested in marching band. Mr. Thomas, I cannot begin to tell you how much money I have invested in marching band. And I do have an asset. My asset is 6'2.5" and weighs 201 pounds. My asset knows his morals and his manners and his multiplication tables. He knows to stand up whenever a woman enters the room because a woman carried him in her body for 9 months and suffered for him to be born, and no matter what he will do in his life, he can't top that. He also knows if he did not choose to stand up when a woman enters the room, his grandmother would chop him off even with his knees. He has already given blood. He is already a registered voter. And Mr. Thomas, I swear to you, he will be an asset to any community he ever chooses to live in. The line went dead. 2 days later, the phone rang. This really pleasant voice, and announced herself as Mrs. Flores from the financial aid office at the university where I had put in the paperwork to receive financial aid for my grandson I had raised. She asked me all the same questions that Mr. Thomas had asked. But you know, they didn't sound the same coming out of her mouth as they had coming out of his. They say attitude is everything, and I believe it. And we talked about how hard it was raising children these days, and after a while, we were getting along so well, I told her my favorite joke about a woman who never got married. Nobody ever asked her. She said when she died, she wasn't having any male pallbearers. She said if the fellas wouldn't take her out while she was still living, and she told me about the man who came down to Texas A&M and made a fortune selling people Cheerios. They bought them because they thought they were donut seeds. And I asked her if she had heard about the time when Forrest Gump died and went to heaven. And she said, no. And I said, he thought he would just sail right in. And St. Peter stopped him and said, you can't come in here unless you can answer 3 questions. Forrest said, what are they? And St. Peter said, well, the first question is, what are the 2 days of the week that begin with the letter T? And Forrest said, today and tomorrow. And St. Peter said, I guess I'll have to accept that as an answer. But question number 2, he said, is how many seconds are in a year? And Forrest said, 12. The 2nd of January, the 2nd of February, the 2nd of March. St. Peter said, oh my goodness, I guess I'll have to accept that one too. But here, said St. Peter, this is the most important of the questions. What is God's first name? Forrest said, Andy. St. Peter said, Andy, where did you get that? Forrest said, we sing it every Sunday. Andy walks with me, Andy talks with me. And she was just howling, laughing. She said, this has been a pleasant conversation. I said, you sound surprised. She said, I am. I don't have pleasant conversations with people on the telephone. I said, gosh, Miss Flores, why is that? She said, well, I am the person in the financial aid office to which they give the files of all the people who were considered completely uncooperative. I said, let me guess. Mr. Thomas gave you my file, right? She said yes, and I began to tell her how things had gone down between me and Mr. Thomas. And when I got to the part about telling about my investments and my asset, she is laughing so hard. You could hear that unmistakable noise of Kleenex being pulled out of a box on somebody's desk. And she said, he's the most tedious person I ever tried to work with in my life. The only thing that means anything to him is numbers, just numbers, that's all. I cannot wait to tell the other people in this office what you said to him. You go out and stand on your porch, you'll be able to hear us laughing all the way from College Station. And then she said, do you happen to have a pencil? I said, sure, I did. And she dictated a number, and I wrote it down. And then I said, Mrs. Flores, what number is this? And she said, that's the number here on my desk. I have just decided to appoint myself your personal financial aid counselor. Thank you. Because people always ask me if these stories are true, I feel a moral obligation to tell you, after all that, Christopher chose a different college.